Phước Tuy Province, South Vietnam, 12th of September 1967. 06:20 hours. The Viet Cong fighter emerged from the tree line with his hands raised. Nguyen Van Thieu had been fighting for 3 years, survived American B-52 strikes, helicopter gunship runs, and countless search and destroy operations. He'd never considered surrender. But for the past 6 days, an Australian patrol had been tracking his squad through the jungle. Not chasing them, not bombarding their suspected positions, just following, silent, invisible, patient. On day 3, Thieu's squad set an ambush. The Australians never walked into it. They'd somehow circled around, watching from 200 metres away. On day 5, his unit tried to lose them by splitting up and crossing a stream. The next morning, Thieu found a playing card, the ace of spades, placed on his discarded ration tin. The Australians had walked through their camp during the night. Could have killed them all. Chose not to. That morning, Thieu's squad leader sent him to collect water. He never went back. Instead, he walked toward the Australian base at Nui Dat, hands high, surrendering to soldiers who'd proven they could kill him whenever they wanted, but had demonstrated something the Americans never had: restraint. Between 1966 and 1971, Viet Cong and NVA forces surrendered to Australian units at rates 300–400% higher than to American forces in adjacent provinces. In Phước Tuy Province, the Chieu Hoi Open Arms defection program recorded 1963 VC surrenders to Australian forces. In the American-controlled neighbouring provinces with triple the population, the numbers were lower, much lower. The question wasn't why the Viet Cong fought, it was why they stopped fighting, but only against the Australians. Right, before we crack on, drop us a comment below. Where are you watching from? What city? What country? And what time is it where you are? Always bloody fascinating to see where our viewers are tuning in from across the globe. Cheers, mates! The statistics told a story American commanders struggled to explain. By December 1968, Australian forces controlled Phước Tuy Province, 2,500 square kilometres with approximately 110,000 civilians. The first Australian task force, never numbering more than 8,000 personnel, recorded 1963 Chieu Hoi defectors between 1966 and 1971. The American 9th Infantry Division, operating in Long An Province with 17,000 troops and a similar-sized population, recorded fewer than 800 defectors over the same period. The Americans attributed it to different enemy forces. Perhaps the VC in Phước Tuy were less committed. But intelligence assessments proved otherwise. The 274th and 275th VC regiments operating in Phước Tuy were main force units, well-trained and thoroughly indoctrinated. D445 Provincial Mobile Battalion was considered one of the most effective VC units in the 3 Corps Tactical Zone. These weren't poorly motivated local guerrillas. They were professional soldiers. American doctrine focused on attrition: find the enemy, fix them in place, destroy them with overwhelming firepower. Search and destroy operations swept through villages and jungle with company-sized units, 120 to 150 men, supported by artillery, helicopter gunships, and tactical airstrikes. The philosophy was simple: kill more VC than they could recruit, and eventually they'd collapse. The Australians fought differently: smaller patrols, longer operations, obsessive intelligence gathering. Where Americans might send a company through an area in 3 days, the Australians would send a 6-man patrol for 2 weeks. The Americans announced their presence with firepower. The Australians announced nothing until it was too late. The difference wasn't just tactical, it was psychological, and the Viet Cong noticed. Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman, commanding 7 RAR in 1970, explained it bluntly. The Yanks wanted body counts. We wanted intelligence. Dead VC don't talk. Prisoners do. Australian patrols operated under strict rules of engagement that prioritised capture over killing when tactically feasible. If a VC soldier could be taken alive without risking Australian lives, that was the preferred outcome. Not for humanitarian reasons, though Australians generally treated prisoners well, but for intelligence value. A captured VC could reveal base camp locations, supply routes, unit strengths, and operational plans. A dead one couldn't. The Americans faced different pressures. Body count was the primary metric of success, reported daily up the chain of command and published in newspapers back home. Battalion commanders competed for the highest kill ratios. Promotions depended on enemy KIA numbers. Taking prisoners was encouraged officially, but not incentivized practically. When an American patrol made contact, the default response was maximum firepower. Call in artillery, request gunship support, destroy the enemy position. Australian commanders measured success differently. Enemy base camps located and destroyed. Intelligence reports filed. VC infrastructure dismantled. Civilian population secured. Major Peter Young, commanding 3 SAS Squadron in 1969, wrote in his after-action report, "We observed a VC company for 11 days without initiating contact. When they led us to their base camp, we called in coordinates. Artillery destroyed their supplies, ammunition and medical facilities. The company scattered. 43 surrendered within 2 weeks. 0 Australian casualties. That's a successful operation. The VC learned quickly, surrender to Australians, fight to the death against Americans." Captured Viet Cong documents revealed the psychology. A directive from D445 Battalion, recovered during Operation Overlord in January 1971, instructed cadres, when encountering Australian units, avoid contact if possible. Their tracking skills make escape difficult. If surrounded, consider Chiu Hoi. They take prisoners. The Americans do not reliably do so. That last sentence was critical. VC intelligence noted that American units, especially after taking casualties, sometimes executed prisoners or called in artillery on surrounded enemy positions, even when surrender was attempted. The Australian reputation was different. If you surrendered properly, hands visible, weapon discarded, approaching slowly, you'd be taken alive. This wasn't Australian compassion. It was calculated policy. Warrant Officer Jack Kirby, serving with 1 SAS Squadron, explained the logic. A VC who thinks he'll be shot if captured fights like a cornered rat. A VC who thinks he might survive surrenders when the odds turn bad. We wanted them thinking about survival, not martyrdom. The Australians reinforced this perception deliberately. Psychological operations teams distributed leaflets showing captured VC being treated well, receiving medical care, adequate food, and family contact through the Red Cross. The leaflets were printed in Vietnamese with photographs and scattered across known VC areas. The message was explicit. Australian forces accept Chiu Hoi. You will not be harmed. Your family will be notified you are safe. American PSYOPs used similar leaflets, but the message contradicted ground reality. When VC attempted to surrender during heavy fighting, the chaos of American operations, multiple units, air support, artillery, often resulted in their deaths anyway. The Australians controlled the battlefield differently. The Australian method created what intelligence officers called cumulative demoralisation. It worked like this. An Australian patrol would track a VC unit for days without attacking. The VC knew they were being followed, would find evidence deliberately left behind. A spent cartridge casing placed on a trail, boot prints in mud that hadn't been there an hour earlier. The psychological message was clear. We see you, we're watching. We could kill you, but we're choosing not to. Yet. Sergeant Bob Patty Condon, an SAS Squadron, described a typical patrol. We tracked a VC platoon for 8 days through the long highs, never closer than 400 metres, never visible, but we made sure they knew. On day 6, we left a note in Vietnamese on their rest stop. "We've been watching. We know where your camp is." That night, 3 of them walked into Nui Dat and surrendered. Said they couldn't sleep anymore, knowing we were out there. The Americans fought differently because they operated differently. American patrols typically lasted 1 to 3 days. Units returned to fire-base perimeters each night. Operations were loud, radios chattering, helicopter resupply, coordinated movements of multiple platoons. The VC could hear them coming and either evade or prepare ambushes. Australian SAS patrols stayed out for 7 to 14 days, sometimes longer. Radio silence except for scheduled brief transmissions. No resupply. They carried everything needed. Movement was deliberate, sometimes less than 1 kilometre per day if tracking required it. They lived in the jungle, not just patrolled through it. The VC couldn't predict Australian movements, couldn't hear them, couldn't escape them. That uncertainty corroded morale in ways American firepower never could. The breaking point came during sustained operations. Australian forces would identify a VC unit, then systematically dismantle their support structure. Not through massive sweeps, but through patient strangulation. Operation Ingham, conducted throughout 1967, demonstrated the method. Australian intelligence identified the 274th VC Regiment operating in the Maytao Mountains. Rather than launching a major assault, Australian patrols, primarily SAS and infantry reconnaissance, began mapping every supply cache, rest area and water source the regiment used. Over 4 months, Australian forces destroyed 23 supply dumps, ambushed 6 resupply parties, and eliminated 3 base camps. They never fought a major battle. The 274th Regiment never saw the bulk of Australian forces, but their logistical network collapsed. Food became scarce, medicine ran out, ammunition supplies were interdicted before reaching them. By August 1967, soldiers from the 274th were surrendering in small groups, often claiming they were starving and had received no pay for months. They described constant movement, never staying in one location more than 2 nights, because the Australians always found us. American operations in adjacent areas followed different patterns. Large-scale sweeps would push through a sector, make contact, call in heavy fire support, count bodies, and withdraw. The VC would disperse during the operation, then return after American forces left. Their supply lines running through Cambodia remained largely intact. There was no sustained pressure, no persistent presence making their daily existence impossible. Captain Robert O'Neill, serving with 5 RAR, noted, "We didn't give them rest. Not dramatic, just relentless. Every water source watched, every trail ambushed eventually. They could fight Americans once and disappear. They couldn't hide from us." The treatment of prisoners reinforced the decision to surrender. Captured VC were processed through the Australian Task Force intelligence system at Nui Dat, where interrogation methods differed markedly from American practice. Australian interrogators, many trained in Malay and Vietnamese languages, used what they termed rapport-based questioning. The approach was pragmatic. A VC who believed he'd be tortured would lie or say nothing. One who believed cooperation might improve his situation would talk. Major Ian Mackay, intelligence officer with 1 ATF in 1968, explained, "We needed accurate information, not what they thought we wanted to hear. That meant treating them as professional soldiers, not criminals." Prisoners received medical treatment for wounds, adequate food, and were generally housed separately from South Vietnamese custody, where treatment was often brutal. The Australians documented that VC who passed through their system and were later released or exchanged often told others that Australian captivity was tolerable. This created a feedback loop. VC soldiers who'd surrendered to Australians would later encounter former comrades still fighting. Word spread, if you're going to surrender, do it to the Australians. They won't torture you. They feed you. They follow the Geneva Conventions. Your family can be notified you're alive. American units faced different challenges. Processing thousands of prisoners through the South Vietnamese system, where torture and summary execution were documented problems, meant that VC soldiers knew American captivity often led to ARVN interrogation centres. The safer choice was fighting to the death or escaping. The Australians built a reputation deliberately, and the Viet Cong responded rationally to the incentives. The tactical differences created psychological effects that compounded over time. American operations were predictable in their unpredictability. Massive firepower applied suddenly, then withdrawal. The VC adapted, disperse when Americans arrive, reassemble when they leave. Casualties were accepted as the cost of revolution. Australian operations were predictable in their persistence. Once Australians identified your unit, they didn't leave. Sergeant Terry O'Farrell, 3RAR, described it. We'd find their tracks, follow for days, locate their camp, watch it, map every entrance, count personnel, identify leaders. Then we'd either ambush them leaving or call in artillery on the camp itself. If they escaped, we'd track them again. They couldn't shake us. This created a specific psychological pressure. VC unit commanders began reporting to higher headquarters that Australian presence made their areas untenable for sustained operations. A captured document from 33rd NVA Regiment, dated March 1971, stated the Australian forces do not operate like the Americans. They are patient. They do not reveal themselves. When they attack, it is precise. Our casualties from Australian ambushes are triple those from American engagements of similar size, because we do not detect them in time to manoeuvre. The lethality ratio supported this. Australian forces in Phuoc Tuy achieved kill ratios averaging 10.1 through most of the war, 10 enemy killed for every Australian casualty. American forces across South Vietnam averaged approximately 3.1. The difference wasn't firepower. Australian units had less artillery support, fewer helicopter gunships, and no B-52 strikes on call. The difference was surprise, precision, and patience. Fighting Australians meant dying without warning. Surrendering to them meant surviving. The VC chose accordingly. The long-term impact became apparent in VC unit cohesion. By 1969, D445 Battalion, which had terrorised Phước Tuy Province in 1966, was combat ineffective. Not destroyed in battle, but hollowed out by defections, casualties from precise Australian ambushes, and the inability to recruit replacements locally. The Australian Civic Action Program reinforced military pressure. While American pacification often meant relocating villages and creating free fire zones, the Australians applied lessons from the Malayan emergency: secure the population, provide services, isolate the insurgents. Medical teams treated Vietnamese civilians. Engineers built schools and wells. Australian soldiers patrolled villages consistently, learning names, building relationships. This created intelligence networks. Villagers who trusted Australians reported VC movements, tax collection schedules, and recruitment efforts. The information fed into patrol planning, making Australian operations increasingly effective. VC cadres found themselves operating in a hostile information environment. The population they depended on was cooperating with the enemy. Former VC fighter Nguyen Van Hau, who surrendered in November 1970, described the pressure. The Americans would come, destroy some houses, kill some people, and leave. We hated them, but we could avoid them. The Australians were different. They stayed. They knew the villages. They knew when strangers arrived. We couldn't hide among the people anymore. And in the jungle, They hunted us like animals. Professional animals. I surrendered because I wanted to live, and the Australians made living possible if you stopped fighting. By 1971, VC main force units largely avoided Phước Tuy Province. The cost of operating there, constant surveillance, high casualties, steady defections, exceeded the strategic value. The paradox was that Australian tactical success couldn't achieve strategic victory. Phước Tuy Province became one of the most secure areas in South Vietnam by 1971, but the war was lost elsewhere, in the Mekong Delta, along the Cambodian border, and ultimately in American domestic politics and Saigon's corruption. When Australian forces withdrew in 1972, the systems they'd built collapsed. The South Vietnamese units that replaced 1 ATF didn't maintain the patrolling intensity, the intelligence networks, or the civic action programs. Within 18 months, D445 Battalion had reconstituted and VC infrastructure had rebuilt. By April 1975, Phước Tuy fell to North Vietnamese forces during the final offensive. But the lessons survived. British SAS units studied Australian Vietnam operations and incorporated their tracking techniques and patrol methodologies. American Special Forces, after Vietnam, examined why Australian counterinsurgency achieved better results with fewer resources. The patient, intelligence-driven, population-centric approach became foundational to modern counterinsurgency doctrine. The surrender statistics remained the most compelling evidence. Between 1966 and 1971, nearly 2,000 VC fighters chose to stop fighting, but only when facing Australians. They'd fight Americans to the death because American operations offered no rational alternative. Australian operations created one: surrender and survive, or continue fighting and die eventually, inevitably, precisely. The Viet Cong were revolutionary fighters, not suicidal ones. When the Australians made survival conditional on surrender and made continued resistance statistically fatal, the VC responded logically. They surrendered. Not because they stopped believing in their cause, but because the Australians made them believe that dying for it against such patient, professional, relentless hunters was futile. That was the difference. The Americans fought a war. The Australians fought a hunt, and the VC knew which one they couldn't win.